Good afternoon. Welcome to Vermont's Law School annual Dr. Martin Luther King birthday presentation. My name is Shirley Jefferson. I'm the Associate Dean for Student Affairs here at Vermont Law School. And I'd like to welcome each and every one of you here today. This is one of my favorite programs, and I say that because growing up in Selma, Alabama, I had an opportunity to march with Dr. King and the late John Lewis. And I remember going to mass meetings and marching and taking part in the civil rights movement. Today, we are uh, uh, really especially grateful to have our keynote speaker, Senator Kesha Ram Hinsdale. She will be our guest speaker. But before we get to her, I would like to tell you that we're going to have a musical selection that was pre-recorded last year by Area King, a student who graduated last year. It is the African American Negro anthem. Lift every voice and sing. Once we've heard that selection, our interim president and dean, Beth McCormick, will bring remarks.
Lift every voice and sing till earth and heaven ring with the harmonies of liberty. Let our rejoicings rise high as the listening skies. Let it resound loud as the rolling sea. Sing a song full of the faith that the dark past has taught us. Sing a song full of the hope that the presence has brought us. Facing the rising sun of our new day begun. Let us march on till victory is won. Stony the road we trod, bitter the chastening rod, felt in the day that hope unborn had died. Yet with a steady beat have not our weary feet come to a place for which our Father sighed. Lest our feet stray to the come to the places, our God, where we met thee, lest our hearts, drunk with the wine of the world, we forget thee. Out from the gloomy past, till now we stand at last, where the white gleam of our bright star is cast. God of our weary years, God of our silent tears, thou who hast brought us thus far on the way, thou who hast by thy might led us into the light, keep us forever in the path, we pray. We have come over a tree that with tears has been watered. We have come, treading a path through the blood of the slaughter, shadowed beneath thy hand. May we forever stand true to our God, true to our native land. Thank you.
When Dean Jefferson asked me to offer some remarks today, I asked her advice on what she thought I should talk about. She said, "You should tell the audience what Martin Luther King Day means to you." So I've been thinking about that and reflecting on what Martin Luther King Day means to me. It, of course, means the things to me that it probably does to all of you. A day of celebration for leadership that changed the country and the world and marked a pivotal step in the civil rights movement. A day of mourning about the tragic assassination of Dr. King and the grief that came from remembering what might have been. It's a reminder of steps forward, steps stalled, and steps not taken yet. But I wanted to offer a more personal take on some of my reflections about the day. First, the day has meant something different and more personal to me since I met Dean Jefferson and heard her story and firsthand account about marching with Dr. King. Dean Jefferson is, for me and for Vermont Law School, a direct link to Dr. Martin Luther King that has made its observance more deeply felt. Second, I've been thinking that Dr. King was 39 years old when he was killed on April 4th, 1968. That's 8 years younger than me, and maybe close in age to some of you. When I was growing up and learning about Dr. King's legacy, he seemed much older and experienced than 39. That he was 39 is a reminder to me and all of you that you are never too young to make a difference. You are never too young to stand up to injustice and to change the world. I suspect many of you in the audience drawn to Vermont Law School for careers in environmental law, environmental justice, and restorative justice know this already. And for others, perhaps hearing that Dr. King was only 39 will be a call to action for you. Third, and relatedly, I've been thinking that Dr. King was our contemporary. I watched the old grainy black and white videos of his speeches and his marches, and it's easy to think of him as a long ago part of history, far removed from today's day and age. But he was born in 1929 and would have been 93 years old today. That's the same age as Barbara Walters and younger than Betty White. That's 5 years older than my father and perhaps the age of some of your grandparents, and 14 years older than President Biden. It is intoxicating to think about what might have been different if he had lived and were with us leading still today. But it's also sobering to reflect on how hard it is to make lasting change, and the energy around great movements is swiftly met with energy and resistance in the other direction. The Black Lives Matter movement's rise in recent years, and especially in the aftermath of George Floyd and other killings of Black men and women by police, are an example of this. With that great rise came the swell of opposition, including the proposal of legislation impacting voting rights, among many other things. The stronger a movement grows, the stronger the opposition grows. But let's all see this not as a reason to give up, but a call to move on and to move more. Dr. King is not here today, but we still are. And finally, I've been thinking about Dr. King as a leader. As a relatively new leader myself and as a teacher, I've been thinking about the attributes that made him an effective leader and how I might strive to develop these attributes in myself and in Vermont Law School students. Here's what I've come up with. Dr. King was not afraid to stand up for what he believed in, and he was not afraid to take risks, to not be liked. And in fact, he was not afraid to be hated and threatened in his life and liberty by many in power. Dr. King was authentic. You can hear his conviction in his voice, and you can see it when you watch him on video. His message was genuine, and it was that intangible but ever-present authenticity that made others follow Dr. King. He could build consensus. He brought many who opposed his views to his side, and he brought many who were neutral behind him. And Dr. King could move people with the written and spoken word. In my own experience, from the big things to the small things, I cannot underestimate how powerful these qualities are for leadership and advocacy. The ability to move people with words and with speech. And notably, I see these qualities in today's speaker, Senator Kesha Ram Hinsdale, so I know you will enjoy hearing from her today. I plan to honor Dr. King this year by working to strengthen and develop these qualities in myself and in Vermont Law School students so that we can effectively stand up to racial and other injustices and continue the work of Dr. King. And I'll leave you with these words, not as often quoted from Dr. King's I Have a Dream speech, but also from that speech and apt for this moment. We have come to this hallowed spot to remind America of the fierce urgency of now. This is no time to engage in the luxury of cooling off or to take the tranquilizing drug of gradualism. Now is the time to make real the promises of democracy. Now is the time to rise from the dark and desolate valley of segregation to the sunlit path of racial justice. Now is the time to lift our nation from the quicksands of racial injustice to the solid rock of brotherhood. Now is the time to make justice a reality for all of God's children. And with that, I will turn things over to Jenny Rushlow.
Hello, everyone. I'm very pleased to be the one to introduce you to Senator Kesha Ram Hinsdale. Senator Ram Hinsdale is a Vermont state senator serving Chittenden County, where she's the first woman of color to have a seat in the Vermont State Senate. She received a Bachelor's of Science in Natural Resource Planning and a Bachelor of Arts in Political Science from the University of Vermont in 2008, where she was Student Government Association president and graduated magna cum laude. She also earned her Master of Public Administration from the Harvard Kennedy School of Government in 2018. Her career in Vermont has spanned preschool education, legal advocacy for victims of domestic violence, and municipal civic engagement. The senator started her service in the Vermont State Legislature in the House of Representatives on behalf of Burlington, Chittenden District 6-4 from 2008 to 2016, where she sat on the House General Housing and Military Affairs and Ways and Means committees, and was vice chair of the House Natural Resources and Energy Committee. She's also served as co-chair of the Vermont Attorney General's Immigration Task Force, and is a member of the boards of Emerge Vermont, the Main Street Alliance of Vermont, Planned Parenthood of Northern New England, the Regenerative Food Network, and the Vermont Natural Resources Council. She currently works as a consultant for towns, school districts, and organizations seeking to improve equity and inclusion in their organizations and policies. Senator Ram Hinsdale has a special place in our hearts at Vermont Law School, as she's been a partner with our Environmental Justice Clinic and the Rejoice Project, which stands for Rural Environmental Justice Opportunities Informed by Community Expertise, which she became involved with in 2018. Through Rejoice, she's led the community core of Rejoice, facilitating community conversations in Rutland and Newport. She engaged with our Environmental Justice Clinic around the drafting of Senate Bill 148, which is an act relating to environmental justice in Vermont, of which she is the sponsor. She has been the driving force in moving forward this important bill. As one of my colleagues said, there is an increasing understanding in Vermont about the necessity for meaningful and inclusive action on environmental justice, but we would not be where we are without Senator Ram Hinsdale. I'd like to introduce you all and welcome to Senator Kesha Ram Hinsdale.
Oh my goodness. Well, thank you, Dean Lowe. And actually, that last quote had me tearing up. It has been a 15-year journey on that bill. So that means a great deal that one of your colleagues said that. First, I just want to say thank you all so much for having me speak and to commemorate the life of the great Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King and his critical legacy. And before I thank, those who have helped frame this day, I also want to acknowledge a couple of key items in terms of the moment that we're in right now as a country. First, I hope people will note, and perhaps some did on campus, that 50 years ago yesterday, Shirley Chisholm launched her historic run for the presidency of the United States of America, the first Black woman to appear on the ballot, a number of historic firsts as she broke barriers. And I can tell you, in my life and career, I have thought a lot about the idea of bringing a folding chair when you don't have a seat at the table. And I certainly stand on her shoulders, and I know Dean Jefferson would agree. I just learned before hopping on, and I hope I have some of the details right because this is breaking news, that we are now looking ahead at a time when perhaps Mr. McCracken's class in White River Valley will see the first Black woman ascend to the Supreme Court of the United States. We just learned that Supreme Court Justice Breyer does plan to step down and retire from the Supreme Court. And it is my understanding that President Biden's first and hopefully second and third choices are to advance the first Black woman to the highest arbiter of justice in the and a body that, if it's job and our what we need done in the country is advancing our rights in the spirit of Brown v. Board of Education and Roe v. Wade. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Senator Kesha Ram Hinsdale, as you've heard, and I've been a resident troublemaker in the state legislature for over a decade. And you heard currently serving as the first woman of color in the state Senate. It's a role and a title that I'm privileged to hold, but a distinction as the only woman of color in the state Senate that I hope not to hold for very long. And all of you can help me in advancing our multicultural democracy, both in Washington and truly want to thank Dean Rushlow for that kind introduction. I was privileged to meet Dean Rushlow when she first got to Vermont Law School, and we spoke about none other than the environmental justice bill and policy framework that we were hoping to advance. So I've been so grateful to have her and so many at Vermont Law School, and especially in the Rejoice team and the Environmental Justice Legal Clinic as partners in that work, deep partners and indispensable to getting this bill so close to passage this year. I want to thank Dean McCormick for helping to frame the importance of reflecting on Dr. King's life and how it was cut short and the overall unfinished business of the civil rights movement. I want to thank Teresa Johnson, Nina Russo, and Justin Campfield for helping to coordinate this event, and Town Meeting TV for helping to broadcast it to so many others. And of course, I want to thank and honor Dean Shirley Jefferson for the invitation to participate in this esteemed event and symposium, and for your leadership at Vermont Law School and across the state, as well as across the country. It really has to sink in for me and hopefully all of you, and maybe this is something you all reflect on more often, but that Dean Jefferson is the second Black woman to have graduated from Vermont Law School, is incredible to think about. And we're so grateful that we have you as a state treasurer, and you've been paving the way for people of color to enter the legal field ever since. You have not, you have lifted others up as you rose. And thinking about Dean Jefferson, that you were there, you were in the fight for justice alongside Dr. King and the late Congressman John Lewis as well, marching from Selma to Montgomery. And I just want to take that in for a moment and think about crossing the Edmund Pettus Bridge and starting that march from Selma to Montgomery. As folks may know, that fateful day on March 7th, not long when we would commemorate that from now, was known as Bloody Sunday because of the violence that Black Americans particularly were met with crossing that bridge and starting that march from state troopers, from people sanctioned by government to harm Americans. And why? For trying to access the ballot box and the right to vote. And that was less than 50 years ago. So it's not something we should forget. It's not something we can forget. And it's an honor to be with Dean Jefferson, to know that she had such a critical role in uplifting our civil rights, access to the ballot box as we know it's in danger once again. I want to start my reflection on the life and legacy of Dr. King by talking about service. It's something that often, we'll wonder, am I doing? We'll ask the question of Dr. King, am I living a life in service to others? That is life's most persistent question, as he would say. But what does it mean to live in service to others? Is it a day of service? Is it a week? Is it a month? Or is it a lifetime? And, what is service? I think about transmitting knowledge and wisdom as one of the greatest forms of service that we can provide. So even this past Martin Luther King Day, I hope many were thinking of it as a day on and not a day off, and how they could help their neighbors, particularly in the time of this pandemic. I was with teachers in Rutland who, despite the snowstorm some may have experienced as well, where the power went out for a time in Rutland, a number of teachers showed up, and wearing our COVID gear and our masks, we worked to cook for the local shelter. And I just thought about this for many educators. This might otherwise be a day of rest, which they deserve because they're doing service every day, but they still chose to treat it as a day on, and to helping those who needed that warm meal on a very cold day. And it makes me think of Dr. King's words: the function of education is to teach one to think intensively and to think critically. Intelligence plus character, that is the goal of true education. And I know in law school, a lot of you, and probably in high school too, for those of you watching who are in high school, a lot of it feels like cramming information and facts and figures into your head. But hopefully, and I think this is a testament to your teachers who have you watching this here today, they're also trying to help you build character and think about what a life in true service looks like. And I don't want you to forget that you're extremely lucky to be in law school. I just hope you stop and think about, those that have gotten you here, family, your educators from earlier in life, the mentors who saw your potential before you did. Very few people make it to law school and are able to help be the arbiters of, how we uphold and dispose of our laws that should, if they're functioning properly and treating everyone equally, protect everyone and make sure that we have a system of laws to fall back on and to have as a backstop for our democracy. And I think about, the educators that have played a monumental role in my life. I didn't have the privilege of going to law school. I did finally get my master's degree after 8 years in the legislature. But so many educators in my life empowered me to be my best self and to make sense of injustice in my life and setbacks that felt insurmountable. The educators and teachers in my life started with my grandmother, who moved from India the day before I was born. I was the youngest, but she always said I waited for her. She had fled the partition of India when the part of India that my family was from became Pakistan. And she never gave up her hope and sense of belief that, with education and with access to learning and to exchange of ideas, anything is possible, especially in a democracy. She taught me how to read and write in cursive when I was 2 years old, which kind of felt like torture at the time, but I can deeply appreciate now because it certainly made me who I am. And, then my parents, who had run an Irish pub in Los Angeles, my Indian immigrant father and my Jewish American mother, who ran an Irish pub, that I grew up waiting tables in and sweeping peanut shells off the floor. Their marriage started to deteriorate. The business went under. And it was right at a time when I met a teacher who was very formative in my life named Kitty Donahoe. She was a no-nonsense Irish woman, and she could see that I was deeply troubled and really struggling. And at the same time, she took a moment to recognize that I could read and write, and I wasn't struggling with what I was learning. I was struggling with everything else outside of school. And I almost turned away from from education, as a form of salvation. And what she did was not say, you're gifted, you're special, we're going to put you in a special program, you can sit in the corner and read books. She said, there's a lot of other students here who didn't have the privilege of that education, who may not have had the opportunity to experience that time with their grandparents or their parents because they came from a war-torn country or their parents had to work, on farms all day. And so we have a lot of kids in our school, this was Los Angeles, who don't speak English and they need your help. And so she asked me to go outside and teach other kids how to read one by one. And of course, that could be a story of service in terms of me giving back to others and feeling good about myself. But what it was a teacher giving her service to me and helping me become a better person by learning. And I saw, beyond that, from a young age, the impact that good policy choices can have on working families like mine as we struggled after the loss of the business. I often now reflect on Martin Luther King's words, Dr. King's words that I think are so, so relevant, particularly in the pandemic as we fight about COVID safety precautions and what it means to truly be in relationship with one another. But I hope you all live by these words and have them in a hall somewhere at Vermont Law School, because they are the reason I get up every day and serve in the state Senate, and hopefully part of the reason that you fight for justice in our legal framework as well. And Dr. King said, it may be true that morality cannot be legislated, but behavior can be regulated. It may be true that the law cannot change the heart, but it can restrain the heartless. It may be true that the law can't make a man love me, but it can restrain him from lynching me. And I think that's pretty important also. So while the law may not change the hearts of men, it does change the habits of men. And when you change the habits of men, pretty soon the attitudes and the hearts will be changed. And I tell you, I keep coming back to those words over and over again, particularly in this moment in the pandemic. But every time I'm looking at what legislation we seek to pass does or doesn't do, I often say that we should really know what our legislation is accomplishing for people. And I often will say, in my mind, one of the greatest, there are three great impacts we have in the policy world. And that's advancing a civil right, changing the criminal code, or getting something in the budget. And so I often ask myself, am I doing those things? Am I working to restrain the heartless or give hope to those who feel oppressed by our laws rather than served by our laws? And I think that too comes from a deep place of what happened in my life as I was growing up. My parents, when they went to open that business, they were an immigrant and a woman. Access to capital was very limited in that time for people like my parents. And the place that they got their loan to open the Irish pub was the Women's Bank of Los Angeles. And I just remember visiting and thinking, wow, there's a lot of nice women who give me candy and sit me up on the counter. But it was actually really revolutionary to have a women's bank, to make sure that women could access capital, given that that system was not designed for them or made for them. In fact, it was made to oppress them. I was a free lunch kid in high school, and I really enjoyed the food I was able to access as a free lunch kid. It was pretty great farm to cafeteria, farm to table options. But I also learned at a formative age that it would be free for me to take the SATs and to apply for colleges because I was a free lunch kid. I would not be before you today if that probably would be considered a small technical change in the law was allowed to pass. It allowed me to dream really big and to end up in a place like Vermont for college. And so I did. And there's also, as we know, a really dark side to government that I've alluded to, that there is harm that can be caused when institutions are left to decay without accountability or justice, without that sunlight that Dr. King would say is the greatest disinfectant on earth, that only light can drive out darkness, and only love can drive out hate. And yet institutions like our policing and criminal justice institutions in many ways have been left without sunlight for far too long. And one of the formative experiences I also had as a young person was being 13 years old and being with a couple of my friends a half a block away from one of those friends' houses. She really needed something at the store. And I look back on that night thinking, you know, it wasn't something she desperately needed from the store, but it shouldn't have been that at 9:45 at night, we were asked, "Are you Mexican? Are you sure you're not Mexican?" And then told we were breaking, and taken 3 hours or taken over an hour away to their police station by 2 officers and detained for several hours, for most of the night, without legal representation or being able to call our families on a school night. And I remember an officer walked up to these 2 officers and said, "Wow, it's pretty late to have these young women here on a school night." And they said, "That's okay. We're getting overtime." And in that moment, I really felt like I lost my humanity, and my friends had lost their humanity. And I remember we had to go to court, to stand trial for this curfew charge. And before the judge threw out that charge and said, "This is ridiculous," the judge asked my name and my birthday, and I could barely speak. I could barely get it across. And I remember thinking, I feel so silenced by this experience, and I never want to feel that way again. And yet I know I'm the exception and not the rule. And so many others would end up feeling silenced by that, criminalized by that, and go down a very different path if they didn't have educators and other adults in their life to help them make sense of what happened. And finally, later in my father's life, as an immigrant, even though he had his citizenship and his green card, he couldn't afford to retire. And he still insisted that he took pride in a hard day's work. And it's painful for me to say this, but 7 years ago, he died of a heart attack while he was holding a catering tray at a Silicon Valley gala, died with the tray in his hands. And, that just, I hope, illustrates that the fight for working families and for the dignity of all Americans is just deeply, deeply personal to me. I know the America that exists when you pull on your bootstraps until they come off, or as Dr. King would say, it's cruel to ask a man to pull on his bootstraps who has no bootstraps at all. I also saw the America that opens the door a crack and lets the light in just long enough for you to glimpse opportunity and keep pushing forward, and knowing that I have family who crossed oceans and broke through barriers and sacrificed everything for me to find that opportunity. All of these experiences have made me who I am. They fuel my passion for what I do, and they are why I serve the state I love. And I take all these experiences as a driving force to commit to live a life in service to others. And so when we revisit that idea of service, Martin Luther King Day is not simply a day of service or a day of reflection. A day of service is a reminder of the power that comes from connecting with neighbors, from knowing you are in community. But a lifetime of service involves good and necessary trouble to free our neighbors from the constraints of injustice. And as John Lewis said, the great Congressman John Lewis once said, our struggle is not the struggle of a day, a week, a month, or a year. It is the struggle of a lifetime. Never, ever be afraid to make some noise and get in good trouble, necessary trouble. And I've been thinking a lot about this quote, even though it's not a quote of Dr. King's, but someone who fought alongside him. I really think in many ways, there is a mainstream effort to kind of co-opt this idea of good trouble, that, someone out there is deeming when trouble is good trouble or not. And the reality is it's only called good trouble after you've won the fight. But really, before it's good trouble, it's just trouble. And unless you're causing trouble and disrupting the status quo and treating, and looking at the stakes being so high and thinking about how to upend what's happening in this country as we stand on the brink with our democracy and our climate, we just can't afford not to cause trouble in this moment, whether someone calls it good or necessary. And I think a lot about that, as you heard with Dr. King, who challenged systems and conventions in ways that made people in his time uncomfortable, in ways that made him hated. People didn't see him as causing good trouble. They just saw him as causing trouble. And this was from voting rights to ending unjust wars abroad that we were involved in, to fighting for sanitation workers. As hopefully many folks know, Dr. King was fighting for garbage workers in Memphis when he was shot and assassinated. And so, you know, he wasn't out there in many people's eyes causing good trouble, but just causing trouble. And so we look back at that and think, you know, I too want to cause good trouble. Well, if we're going to save the soul of America, you know, we can't let the mainstream be the ones to decide if it's good trouble or not. And so these, you know, as Dr. King would say, you know, especially when we think about our North Star, it can't just be causing good trouble. When he looked back on the civil rights movement in its early years, he said, we were convinced that we could not limit our vision to certain rights for Black people, but instead affirmed the conviction that America would never be free or saved from itself until the descendants of its slaves were loosed completely from the shackles they still wear. And I think about that, you know, so in so many ways, you know, when we think about the soul of our nation and our democracy, it frees all of us to recognize that the original sins of our nation were the erasure and genocide of Indigenous people and the enslavement and profit on the backs of Black Americans and originally slaves. And we see the legacy so deeply of the slave trade, of the profiting from those dual sins of this nation in our current laws. And your job in so many ways is to root that out. And the best way, you know, that we can do that is to ensure that people are everywhere from school board to the district attorney's office to the highest offices in the land who support justice and access to voting rights, which Dr. King called the foundation stone for political action. And so in a time where we're seeing the painful and agonizing rolling back of voting rights, the life of Dr. King is a reminder that our charge is to continue the struggle for those whose shoulders we stand on, like Dean Jefferson and like so many she marched with. And that will invite brutality, danger, and the loss of reputation, the risk of one's life. It is not just good trouble. It is truly trouble that we must persist in causing. And so you heard a little bit about my decade in the legislature. It's a tremendous honor to even be put in the same sentence as Dr. King. But I have often stopped and thought, I will make people uncomfortable. I will afflict the comfortable and comfort the afflicted, because that will actually change attitudes and behaviors in my colleagues and hopefully in Vermonters. And it also reminds me of a Dr. King quote that human progress is neither automatic nor inevitable. Every step toward the goal of justice requires sacrifice, suffering, and struggle, the tireless exertions and passionate concern of dedicated individuals. And I bring up that quote because we often talk about the arc of the moral universe bending toward justice, as though that arc exists and it's already bending and we just have to find the justice. But the reality is, unless we tug on that arc, it's gonna snap back. We're gonna lose that arc to injustice. And so it is our job to pull as hard as we can on that arc and bend it toward justice. And that takes careful crafting. It takes a long, long time to build toward that action. And you heard a little bit about the environmental justice bill that I've been working on now for almost 16 years. And when I was closer to your age, many of you, I introduced what would have then in 2007 been Vermont's first environmental justice bill. I wrote a 100-page thesis. I was a senior at UVM on why this was needed. And I talked about mobile home communities that didn't have access to clean drinking water and migrant farm workers that were stuck in the shadows without clean, safe places to work, and immigrant and new American communities that were suffering from a greater burden of lead poisoning because they couldn't talk to their landlords about what was happening. And a lot of everyday Vermonters in rural areas who grew up near asbestos mines or Superfund sites and weren't sure why there was a cancer cluster in their family or their community. And all of this I brought to the legislature, and I was told, this is a solution in search of a problem. We're a green and beautiful state, and this is not the issue of a rural state like Vermont. These are the issues of urban places where refineries go up next to elementary schools and things like that. And I truly heard and absorbed that, because it wasn't the language of a rural state like ours to be talking about this as environmental justice. And yet what we did in our effort that many of you have been involved in, and I thank you for that, is travel the state and bring those folks in community, sit in rooms where older Vermonters said, I don't know if this counts as environmental injustice, but my neighbor was so isolated that she died, and it took us 5 days to realize that she had passed. And those kinds of stories would just stop the room and have people thinking, I don't know what environmental justice is. I don't know if I'm an environmentalist, but I know that's wrong. And I know we deserve communities that give us life, not take life away from us. And we deserve to breathe air and drink water that's not killing us. And so that's the fight that we've been engaged in for about 15 years, just in Vermont alone. And I'm just so proud, because I needed more partners in this coalition. I felt very alone when I was one of the only people of color in the legislature in 2008 and 2009, first advancing the bill. And so to have this coalition that's durable, that's strong, that's speaking in the with many messages and as many messengers to those who need to hear this, and uniting our environmental movement behind those who will be most left behind in climate change and in the dramatically changing weather patterns in our country and our state, those who are facing heat vulnerability, flooding vulnerability. As I try to point out wherever I go, and I know folks in the legal clinic know this well, in Tropical Storm Irene that devastated our state, 8% of the state population were mobile home park residents, but they were 40% of those affected by the flooding in Irene. And so it was not up to me whether or not I was going to keep causing trouble or keep trying to get past those who called this a problem, a solution in search of a problem. I needed to do this work, and I needed to make people uncomfortable and start to listen to voices that they hadn't been listening to before to get this passed. And we are so extremely close. So it's not a moment to celebrate yet, but it is a moment to pause and reflect and know that we have come so far, and that has taken so many of you, and it has taken folks around you in NAACP chapters and social justice organizations and the environmental movement finally admitting to its own past and its own mistakes or oversights or the marginalization of people that it didn't consider part of the environmental movement. And so we all have to acknowledge where we have left people behind in order to move forward together. And I'm really grateful that we're starting to do that. I could go on about a lot of legislation. I feel like I have been talking for a good long time. I will maybe tell one more story and then give my closing thoughts. As you know, a lot of folks in my life know, I could keep talking about these legislative stories, and I hope to do that in the Q&A portion as well. But going back to being that scared teenager dealing with the LAPD, I would just remember my father came to pick me up. My father, who the second he got off the plane from India, heard "go back to Mexico," and heard, "you're a criminal," was pulled over, was dealt with having officers pull him over all the time in Los Angeles, running his license plate, telling him his car was stolen, that the tires were stolen. He dealt with so much from the police, and he vowed to not have us go through the same thing. And so it broke my heart in a way that I could barely express when he had to come pick me up from the police station in the middle of the night. That man screamed so loud at those police officers. I thought we were both going to end up in jail that night, but it was the pain of somebody who fought so hard to make this country better and still saw these institutions turn away from what is good and right. And it's work that I have picked up in the legislature. And when we were passing our first bill in Vermont on bias in policing, we could barely talk about qualified immunity and the injustice that's present in so much of our so-called criminal justice system. But we were starting by asking to talk about bias in policing. And we had, people getting up on the House floor and saying, "I don't see the need for this bill. We don't have very many people of color." And, and we had one legislator from Rutland who said, "And the people who are here who are people of color, they are dealing drugs. I know that to be true. we had a legislator say that and then quote Martin Luther King. It was the strangest day of my life in the legislature. And so I felt like there was no other choice. And often women of color feel this. I could not be silent. People would die. I mean, people's lives were on the line if I did not get up and say something. And so I got up and I told that story about the LAPD. And I told, I talked about how voiceless I felt and how I'd never wanted anyone else to feel that way again, that their humanity was being stolen the way mine was, the way my father's before me had been. And the people who were really working to advance this bill to eradicate bias and work toward impartiality in policing were members of our migrant farm worker community. They often face deep harassment of men and Black Vermonters, but they face deep harassment and being asked, their nation of origin, often ending up having a punishment that far outweighs the crime of perhaps speeding or something like that on the roads and ending up in deportation proceedings. And as some folks may know, if you've ever been to the State House, which is hard to do right now in a pandemic, you're not allowed to clap, you're not allowed to hoot and holler from the gallery. You have to be silent. And the migrant farm worker community that came to plead for this bill was sitting behind me, and I couldn't see them. And all I knew was that all these legislators were looking at me with tears in their eyes, because as I told my story, all of the migrant farm worker community folks behind me stood up. They just stood up behind me and said, "This speaks for me," with their action. They just said, we can't say a word. We might be retaliated against if we speak up, but we can stand right now and honor that this story is our story. And so it's moments like that that make everything I do worthwhile and make the pursuit of justice incredibly meaningful, not just for me, but for those who often don't have voices in the halls of power. And it's something that you all can do too. And I wanna end with a story that gives me a lot of hope to think about. I feel like it's a story a lot of Vermonters can hopefully relate to. And it's really what it's about to be an accomplice versus an ally in the fight for justice. And so, as many folks may remember, hopefully you remember, there's a now famous image of a woman scaling a flagpole in South Carolina from 2015 to pull down a Confederate flag that flew at the South Carolina Capitol. Her name is Bree Newsome Bass. She's become a nationally renowned figure. She continues to be a thought leader at the time and probably still. In addition to being a strong Black woman, she was a housing rights organizer and someone who was not afraid to stand on the front lines of justice. Let me tell you what I know from the story, that Bree Newsome Bass was not a climber of flagpoles before that day. She was not much of a climber at all. And yet, if you Google that picture and you look closely, she has a helmet, she has safety gear, she's ascending that flagpole like she knows exactly what she's doing. And so how did she get to that moment, right? Because as we talk about environmental justice and so much of the environmental movement, particularly leaving people of color behind, it's not common for women of color to have grown up being able to engage in that level of outdoor recreation, climbing things, having access to the outdoors in that way. Well, that's where a man named James Ian Tyson comes in, and a lot of other folks who surrounded Bree in order to get her up that flagpole. And James Ian Tyson and some other South Carolinian activists who were white men helped Bree learn how to climb. They spent the days and days before she scaled that flagpole, helping her to learn how to climb safely and successfully to pull that Confederate flag down. And they knew they could probably do it in 10 seconds flat, but that it had to be a Black woman who was lifted up to help pull that Confederate flag down. And another part of the story is that as she went to pull that flag down, as she was climbing the flagpole, the police showed up, right? We don't often see the video or know the story of the police being, it looks like they're standing around just like, oh, what are we going to do? She's already up there. Well, the police were going to tase the metal pole that she was climbing. And that probably could have led to her death, her being paralyzed or absolutely seriously injured. And what did James Ian Tyson do, who was spotting her? Because that's a good thing to do when you're climbing, is have someone looking out for you. he put his hand on the flagpole. He just put his hand on the flagpole so that if they tased her, they tased him too. And so often that is what it takes, is thinking about what situations am I in where I'm willing to put my hand on the flagpole, where I'm not only spending a lot of my time and energy helping to make space for and uplift and give voice to Black Americans around me or people who are marginalized, but where are the moments where I'm willing to put my hand on the flagpole and put myself in harm's way because I know I'll be in less danger than particularly Black Americans who have suffered for so long before me. And so, you know, before I end, I just want to say how much of a privilege it is to speak with you. And, you know, we had planned this talk long before I was seeking an even higher office than I'm privileged to hold now. And we actually learned recently that if I were to be elected to Congress, which I'm running for, that I would end up being the first Jewish person of color to serve in Congress. And I bring that up because for so many years, my relationship to Dr. King was through faith. And it was through realizing that we need a moral power and a moral compass and some kind of parameters around our lives that help us build that character alongside our intelligence, to be able to truly understand where Dr. King's deep strength and sense of what is right and wrong came from. And he had a great friend and confidant that some folks may know, Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel, a Jewish leader, you know, who spent many days and nights talking with Dr. King and marching by his side and making sure the Jewish community was right there with the Black community fighting. And his words guide me in my complicated identity in many ways, being Hindu and Jewish, and thinking about, you know, where does religion and spirituality play a role in all of this? And so one of the things that I appreciate so much about what Rabbi Heschel has said is that the opposite of good is not evil. The opposite of good is indifference. And so apathy, more than malice, is one of our greatest threats. And to that, he would add, as one of our greatest threats in this country, that racism is man's gravest threat, because it is the maximum of hatred for a minimum of reason. And as you go forward, your job in the legal world is to help advance reason and root out hatred in the law, root out racism in the law and the institutions that you are seeking to represent and build on to form a more perfect union in this country. So it's on all of us together to share in Dr. King's dream and to deliver on his vision, to courageously advance a bold vision for a multicultural democracy while building a responsive government that meets the everyday needs of Vermonters and Americans. With principles, passion, and proven leadership, together we will stay in the fight until we live up to the promise of our nation. We will persist to be our ancestors' wildest dreams while delivering a world to our children that is better than we found it. To dream and deliver, that is our fight, and to get in trouble without letting someone else define whether it's good or necessary trouble if we are truly going to save our democracy and the soul of this nation. Thank you.
Thank you so much for those incredible, inspiring remarks, Senator. To our listeners, I want to invite you now to ask some questions, and you'll have the opportunity to have some dialogue with the Senator. So if you have a question, you should type it into the chat, and I believe Teresa Johnson has put some instructions in the chat for how you can do that, and those will get transported over to me and I will ask them. So our first question for you, Senator, is one of our viewers would love to hear your thoughts on the Vermont constitutional amendment on the table right now.
So I just learned that there's some volume issues. I can try to speak up, but was that resolved as well? Were people able to hear me okay?
Yes,
okay.
That was resolved.
Okay, great. It was a long time ago, so I hope it wasn't just talking without people being able to hear me. So, you know, there are actually, this person asking the question may know, 2 constitutional amendments on the table, Prop 2 and Prop 5. And I believe that they are intrinsically linked and in many ways need to advance together. Prop 2 would strike all language related to slavery from our Constitution. And for those who may not be aware of paying close enough attention to this constitutional change in Vermont, the idea is that we have a pretty muddled version of abolishing slavery. Vermont is a state that's always been proud to say we were the first state to abolish slavery, but it's a fairly muddled abolition here. It talks about until you can't be enslaved beyond this age, and indentured servitude is different. So it has all these caveats, and many people see striking that language as truly living up to the values that we hold, that no person should be in servitude to others, and hopefully truly that Black Lives Matter. But we also should recognize that we have a prison population that deserves some form of dignity. And hopefully folks at Vermont Law School know, we still pay very small amounts of money, pennies on the dollar, to folks employed through the prisons to make stationery, to make license plates, et cetera. So there are many of us who want to use this moment to not just, again, are we just causing good trouble by striking old language, or are we causing trouble by looking at the way that people are exploited today? And that, in my mind, is very linked to Prop 5, the proposition on access to abortion and reproductive liberty and freedom that would enshrine those freedoms in our Constitution in a way that, hopefully, and I believe this to be true, will guard against the changes that our Supreme Court may rain down upon us, and the scaling back of Roe v. Wade, and hopefully allow us to continue to be a safe place for anyone who's seeking access to abortion care to get that access. But I do think it was important that we debate these issues together, because particularly for women of color, reproductive freedom and liberty is not just about the right to an abortion. It's about safety from eugenics, and it's about the right and ability to bring a healthy pregnancy to term. And when we look even at Vermont, we have disparities in access to maternal health care. And so that legacy of exploitation and slavery continues to show up in the disparities that immigrant folks face, that Black folks face, and others face, in ensuring that no matter their reproductive choices, they have full access to that support, liberty, and care.
Okay, thank you. Our next question is asking whether there are any initiatives statewide in Vermont regarding social workers alongside law enforcement during patrols. And the viewer is thinking of the program in Hartford, Vermont.
Yes, and I'm so grateful to many of our communities for demonstrating that leadership. That's come up in Montpelier, that's coming up in communities in Chittenden County. I'm so grateful to hear it's coming up in White River Junction, as well as in Brattleboro. And, we look around at, other parts of the state and, beyond Chittenden County. But if we start with Chittenden County, we look at disparities that rival the Deep South. So if you look at the population of youth in Chittenden County, 2% of the youth population are young Black men. They make up 25% of those charged as youthful offenders, 10 times the population that are represented, 10 times the number represented in the population are represented in youthful offenders. We are creating a school to prison pipeline that is deep and unfortunate. I have introduced legislation to try and break that school to prison pipeline and, for example, stop the use of suspension and expulsion as the main behavioral tool for our young people, and work with our educators to accomplish that. And with these policing initiatives, I'm trying to underscore that with an effort to get resources to communities to do that work. So we have a cannabis law that's about to take effect, where people can now purchase retail marijuana and cannabis products. And I have called for a portion of the revenue to go toward community conversations around alternatives to policing for public safety. And it's time we reinvest in our communities after the failed war on drugs, and consider doing exactly what this questioner is talking about.
Our next question is one I would struggle to answer, but I know you'll do great. What is the greatest challenge facing activism today?
Oh, that's a great question. I hope my answer doesn't disappoint folks, because I think it cuts both ways. But I think a lot, as I said, the opposite of good is not evil, it's indifference, it's apathy. And I do think in many ways, social media is a tool that can be used to amplify messages and enrich activism, but not if it becomes our master and we tweet something or we put something out there in a post and it gets a bunch of likes and we think, wow, I have solved the problem. So I think as long as activism is rich and deep and still involves relational thinking and building true movement and thinking a lot about those left behind, not just those in your echo chamber, then it'll continue to remain strong. But I do think social media, is often a tool. I always say, I worry about us losing our freedom of speech or our freedoms that are guaranteed to us in the Constitution, but they're a lot easier to take away if we don't think we're missing them. And so if we continue to just write in Twitter, what we think, and we think that's my free speech, we're missing that, people are losing those freedoms in the press, they're losing them in assembly, in our communities without the fear of being shot. And so, we have to remember that our freedoms are easier to take away if we don't miss them.
We have a follow-up to the earlier question about law enforcement. Inmates are still being transferred to out-of-state prisons. Do you want to express your viewpoint on that topic?
I actually just expressed my viewpoint on that in Senate Government Operations yesterday, the committee I serve on, where I asked how many inmates are currently out of state in private prison. And we have 137 inmates in Mississippi in a core civics prison. In fact, a private prison that was taken to task for celebrating Martin Luther King Day and acting like they had the right to do that, which infuriated a lot of folks. But I have talked to our corrections department about how to bring those inmates back into state, which, as folks can hopefully appreciate, means they have more access to their families, more access to the rights and resources that can be garnered in facilities that are public in our state, where they can help be truly rehabilitated. And of course, I'm somebody who believes that we should try to keep people out of prison in the first place. And that has to do with our system of criminal injustice and making it just, particularly policing and ending the school to prison pipeline. I do believe currently, for example, that we have within our reach the ability to close the women's prison. In most women in prison, most people who identify as female are in prison for property crimes. They are in a temporary facility that was made permanent, that is not meant for permanent habitability. They are not getting significant programming or access to their children. So I think we can start thinking about ways to dismantle our prison industrial complex, starting with things that are within our reach and eventually working towards a system that's far more just and has no place for private prisons within it.
Okay, I think we have time for about one more question. I'm going to exercise my moderator's prerogative. You spoke about so much of your work being about making people uncomfortable, and coming from a background of advocacy and litigation, that's something I can really relate to. And so for our students who are in training to make good trouble and probably have long careers of making people uncomfortable, that can be really exhausting and personally challenging work. And how do you take care of yourself to survive those long days and weeks and months of making other people uncomfortable?
I think we see with the squad in DC or some of our, resident troublemakers in Washington and around the country, that while they make good trouble and make trouble, period, many of them are still looking for ways to come to the negotiating table and not walk away empty-handed. We're seeing it with the Build Back Better bill and access to paid family leave. We're seeing it with the Green New Deal, other proposals where, we want to make sure we're standing firmly in our conviction, but that doesn't mean we can't build consensus and work together. And Dean McCormick talked about the murder of George Floyd. I sometimes tell a story that means a lot to me because I am certainly a resident troublemaker in the state Senate, and that can be exhausting as well for me. And toward the end of session, in the last week of session, I had been working with activists on a resolution leading up to May 25th, which was the year anniversary of the murder of George Floyd by Derek Chauvin. And it was a resolution around remembering that day as a commemorative day, but also a day of action around policing and around social justice. And as I wrote that resolution, I went to my colleagues and said, I have about 24 hours to get this resolution in because we're at the end of session and this needs to be out to the public by May 25th. Within 24 hours, every single member of the state Senate, some of whom I disagree with a great deal on many things, all 30 members of the Senate had signed on to that resolution. And it meant an incredible, it just helped me get through my first year in session, knowing I wasn't just causing trouble, that it was amounting to something. And then of course, the Democrats on my committee said, oh, well, you wrote the resolution, so we anticipate you're just gonna read the resolution on the floor and get things over with. And I said, well, actually, there's only one Black man in the state Senate. That's not me. I don't have the lived experience that's most relevant to read this resolution. It's Senator Randy Brock, who is the Republican minority leader and a former sheriff in Vermont. And I asked Randy, would you be willing to read this resolution? And he skipped a beat, but then he said yes. He said it would mean a lot to him to read the resolution. And so, when he got up on the Senate floor and talked about that he mostly agrees with law enforcement, but in this instance, they were wrong. And when law enforcement is wrong, they should be held accountable. That changed more hearts and minds. That was a much different messenger that people were not expecting than if I had read the resolution. And so while you might be shouting, in your megaphone and, holding your ground, still look around for those that you can bring with you, and still look around to see if there's a better messenger or someone who can reach others that you can't reach as you do this work.
That's such a powerful story and a great example of what a master communicator you are. So thank you so much for those. That was really interesting, great stories to hear about your life and your experience and what you bring to your political and community work. So we thank you very much for your time.
Thank you.
I think now we're going to turn it over for a musical selection and then some closing remarks.
We shall overcome. We shall overcome. We shall overcome someday. Oh, deep in my heart, I do believe we shall overcome someday. We shall live in peace. We shall live in peace. We shall live in peace someday. Oh, deep in my heart, I do believe that we shall overcome someday. We are not afraid. We are not afraid. We are not afraid today. Oh, deep in our hearts, we do believe that we shall overcome someday. We shall overcome. We shall overcome. We shall overcome someday. Oh, deep in my heart, shall overcome someday. Thank you, everyone.
I thank the senator for such a powerful, touching, and emotional speech. Senator, you are a storyteller. Keep telling those stories and keep fighting for us Vermonters. And as you were speaking, I was thinking about a song. We who believe in freedom cannot rest, and we cannot rest. And I know I won't rest. I'd like to also thank Teresa Johnson, Nina Russo, Karen Henderson, Justin Campfield, Dean Jenny Ruslow, and interim President and Dean Beth McCormick. Thank you all for making this a great program. And Mr. McCracken, I owe you one. Thank you for letting the high school students participate today. And I would just like to apologize for the technical difficulties that we were encountering and would say that we are recording and it will be on our website and we will send this out to the students. So let's keep the fight and thank you all for participating in our annual Dr. Martin Luther King program. Thank you and be safe.